Yes.
Yeah.
Hi friends, my name's Trish Roberts and this is Dee Dee River, and we thought we would talk a little bit about gender issues and gender constructions and
social constructions
of gender. And so we were, I was watching Jeff Ginter earlier today, and he was talking about, the problems with gender stereotypes, and there's been quite a lot recently about that in relation to mass shootings. And so Dee Dee has a master's in sexual health, and she knows a fair bit about this issue. So I thought we'd pick Dee Dee's brains, and and so Dee Dee, what would you say about what is gender, and what are your thoughts about that?
Okay, basically there's two
things. Before we go on, sorry, can everybody hear okay? Can you hear us, Rob and Mindy? I realise this is sort of late in New York or on the East Coast, etc.
Can you see there are comments?
So, love to you, Maria. And if anybody can't hear us, just let us know. Oh, you can hear? Okay. Thanks for that, T. All right. So we'll just continue. So, yes, Dee Dee, if you could just...
Basically, the difference between sex and gender is sex is said to be the biology, and gender is said to be the way we behave as men and women. And they tend to differentiate that in any kind of academic framework as, sex is male and female, and gender is man and woman. Now, I'll just say here, sex is not as simple as male and female. They figure something like 1.7% of the population is intersex in some way. The process of sexual differentiation biologically is complex, but outside of people having sex or people having children or infants who have ambiguous genitalia at birth, sex really doesn't matter a whole lot. In our lives, we relate to people in terms of gender. And gender is all about the, pink, we'll have the baby reveal parties where you have, pink for girls and blue for boys. And interestingly, there's been some reporting lately about the fact that as much as, 60, 70 years ago, those colors were reversed. Pink was seen as for boys because red is an active color and blue is a calm spiritual color, and so that was for girls.
Isn't that interesting? I'd never heard about that until Dee Dee mentioned that.
Yeah, it was like that from probably the 1880s, 1890s. Of course,
they were wearing white, weren't they?
Before then, they were wearing white because really you just wanted to have something that you could wash and throw into a copper boiler and boil the bejesus out of it and hang it up and clean. And starch and
my
stuff
grandmother
like that.
had one of those big copper boilers.
Yeah.
So anyway, so they were wearing white. And
so
then
they were all wearing white, and they were all wearing dresses because that lets you just lift it up and clean the baby, and that's fine. And you can see that in pictures of royalty and stuff like that from, the 19th century and so on. They're almost always wearing dresses.
True.
And it's true, and it wasn't until really probably 1940s, 1950s that the commercialization kicked in and really pushed this idea of having different stuff for gendered children. You have boys' stuff and girls' stuff.
Why do you think that?
That way you can't just have kids' stuff.
Why did that happen around that time in the 40s?
To make money.
Oh, okay, so it was a commercialization.
It was a commercialization. It was production. It was new textiles, new dyes, washing machines, things like that.
Wow.
As opposed to just boiling your stuff. Anyway, gender is seen by anthropologists as something which is really quite different in different societies. What it means to be a man in Polynesia or among the Inuit or among the Italians or among the Aboriginals. It's all seen as having different signs. What women wear is different, depending on whether you're in Rajasthan, where they might wear a salwar kameez, which is kind of a big pair of loose pants, or a sari, or something else.
Really sensible clothes,
really
actually.
Sensible clothes.
Yeah, and
it's
beautiful
like
at the same time.
If you're a man in Bedouin culture, you wear a long dress, and you still see that, with the Saudis and things like that.
Yeah, in Afghanistan.
It's called a robe, or it's called a galabaya, or something like that. They'll have their own names. But the thing is that what is men's clothing or women's clothing, and men's behavior and women's behavior varies in different countries. For instance, in Indonesia or Malaysia, it's been much more traditional for women to have a much more equal role in society, and they often run businesses and all of that kind of thing. And interestingly, there you find the height of men and women is not so sexually divided. They all tend to be about the same height. In places like China or Africa and stuff, you see women carrying these huge loads on their heads, and this is traditional. In Western society, we think, oh, women are weak. You're going to have a man carry that. It's culturally defined. And this is one of the first kind of clues that gender is socially constructed. And it's something that happens right from the beginning, from birth, from before birth. As soon as people realize what gender a child or a fetus will be, they start kicking into overdrive with, oh, my little boy is going to be like this, my little girl is going to be like this. I'll have to do up the nursery in pink and, princess stuff. And, and there's really no consideration of the fact that not all girls really like that stuff.
But little babies, they're just little babies.
Babies are just little babies. But
they all kind of, they sort of all look the same pretty much. And,
psychologically, we start putting stuff on them, and we start behaving towards them in certain ways. Parents will talk differently to little boys.
Marie is saying gender is a
social construct.
Absolutely, Marie. Yeah, well done.
And academically, there's basically been two frameworks. One is that of Judith Butler, who takes a postmodernist view that much of our sense of self is created from the narratives and the words and our language. And she sees a lot of the way we socially construct gender as linguistic. And then there's the sociological school that follows from Goffman, where, and that's Weston Zimmerman, who did the paper Doing Gender. And it's about gender being sort of an aspect of our nature that we kind of authorize. It's an overarching thing, and we try to authenticate ourselves as a certain gender. And we do this in lots of small ways. And there's lots of ways of authenticating ourselves. We can authenticate ourselves as tomboys, and that's different than authenticating ourselves as boys. We can authenticate ourselves as, as girly girls, as serious girls, as sports playing girls, as cheerleaders. There's many ways, but they're all an authentication.
Did you say we need to authenticate ourselves, or society is making us? Psychologically, yeah.
People feel a need to do this, and society will basically penalize people who don't do it and don't do it right. Basically, people who are transgressive in the way they present their gender or behave face penalties. And somebody's saying not with First Nations. Yes, I mean, this is, a lot of other cultures have more than two genders. Yeah, the two-gendered model is a very Western one. Even Islam, in the Quran, I think they say that Allah created three genders, male, female, and the ones in between. And they have a word for that. It's in the Quran. And this is one of the reasons, a country like Iran is actually the country that has the second highest number of gender changes, of gender surgeries, gender affirmation surgeries after Thailand. People don't realize that. But
that back to that Indigenous thing. That we watched a great when Harlan Pruden came over to Australia, and he did an excellent talk about Two-Spirit, and it was really fascinating. What did you take from that, Didi?
Well, basically that, and this, you can't generalize about First Peoples. They're tribal, and each tribe...
And we're a couple of white people, so we're talking...
Yeah,
but
each tribe will have a different understanding of these things, and often different words and different levels of acceptance. I mean, some Native American tribes are, and I use that just because for an Australian Aboriginal tends to mean Australian Aboriginals. Native American people, I mean, there are tribes that are matriarchal or matrilineal. There are tribes that are patriarchal or patrilineal. The main thing to remember is that most of them will have some way of accommodating people who don't fit the standard gender roles. The thing to remember is that almost all cultures have standard gender roles. The Western European culture tends to have really rigid ones. Polynesian cultures and stuff like that have much more flexible ones. A lot of the Native American ones have much more flexible ones. It varies throughout the world.
Did you want to talk about, say, during ancient Greek times, how there was this sort of idea of with homosexuality that men had to be. Did you, or is that not relevant to this?
Kind of.
This is a different conversation.
I will say, like a lot of homosexuality in earlier times was seen to some degree as having something to do with gender difference as well. And you see, traces of that in the way gay men talk about each other as she or queens or all of that.
Not all
talk
gay
about
men.
Themselves, not all men, but I mean, it happens. Most people have heard about it. People, you see it in newspapers or including gay newspapers where they talk about, well, we just love shopping. Really? And is that a feminine trait? And is that, because all women love shopping? Well, they don't. We don't.
Yeah.
You know.
So anyway, that's taking constructs and
it's taking constructs and
making
applying
it. So that's not helpful. Not
not
all gay men do that, but just it's just something that happens.
Back a ways, that huge division in terms of male homosexuality between quote active males and quote passive males. And active males were people like Alexander the Great and Achilles and Hadrian, who had boyfriends and raised towns to create funeral pyres for them. But,
yes.
but they were seen as really
Alexander the Great actually
the ultimate men. But they had boyfriends. They were gay. They were not gay because gay didn't exist then, but they were people whose affection and sexuality was towards people of their own gender. But, then you get other people who, in the Roman Empire and stuff, who were killed because they were too effeminate. Because while it was fine to have a male lover and have a male sexual partner if you were a manly man, it was, completely wrong. to be effeminate.
Yeah.
For
and
a
see,
man.
that's where
and this is where you get the patriarchy.
The patriarchy, and which it'd be great to just for those who aren't familiar with that word. But just wait a minute. That's where also misogyny sort of flows through history, and misogyny is alive and well today. You only have to look on social media. It's frightening how full-on misogyny is on social media. But anyway, would you like to talk about patriarchy, just sort of what that is?
I'll talk about it briefly.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I'll just make the connection.
When we sat down, we sort of weren't sure exactly how we were going to structure this, and we laughed and laughed, and I thought, God, we're going to get on, and I won't be able to ask you anything because I'll be giggling too much. Anyway, so we're just going to muddle through this, but we'll get there.
Okay. Well, basically, when you start talking about gender roles, I don't want to talk at this point about transgressive gender. I will get into that, definitely.
Okay.
But, we have these gendered expectations and these stereotypic gender norms that we're expected to fall into, whether we're male, female, or if there is options for being in between. These norms, are often tied into the structures of society where women, we have a matrilineal or a matriarchal society. Of course, the norms for women are very different than for patriarchy. And patriarchy is where the men are in charge. And one of the first things
it's been a problem, hasn't it, women?
when you have men in charge, they usually want to know, is this my baby? Because it starts to be very individualistic rather than communal. And when it's this is my baby, I want to do stuff for my baby, not for the community. Then it becomes really important for men to know, is this my baby or not? And then it becomes really important to keep women constrained. You have to, shut down women's sexuality. You have to make sure that woman is a virgin right up to the time, a man has sex with them. And then you want to make sure she never strays, because how else can you tell? You know absolutely whose mother a child is. You don't know for sure who their father is, unless, of course, you can absolutely keep that woman in a box.
And how did patriarchy? I guess it's probably through strength and I don't know how did patriarchy end up?
Patriarchy came about basically
more in the
from
West,
power.
More in the West than elsewhere.
Well, I think it's come about pretty much everywhere. A lot of places for patriarchy.
Yeah,
but I think it's the privileging of the warrior caste. You have classically if you go back to Aristophanes, one of the early Greek playwrights, he wrote a trilogy called the Oresteia trilogy, which was about the Trojan War. And Clytemnestra was Helen's sister. And Agamemnon was Clytemnestra's husband, and he was Menelaus's, Helen's husband's brother. So although Helen got taken from Menelaus to Troy, and that started the Trojan War, it was Agamemnon who was the alpha male who went off to war and led the troops. When he did, up till that point, Aristophanes presents Clytemnestra as the queen, as the matriarch, and he is her consort and warlord. And he's gone off with this army, and he's gone off with her daughter. And one of the first things he does when he's stuck when he's stuck with some winds, is sacrifice his daughter, who is the heir to the queen. And from the mother's standpoint and the matriarchy's standpoint, there is no worse crime. So he's gone off there. He has the Trojan War. He comes back with Cassandra. They greet them 10 years later, and Clytemnestra brings him into the house and hacks him up with an axe. Because she's the bloody queen. He killed her heir. He's just the consort, and she's boss.
And this is
a Greek tragedy.
What's the message with that one?
Well, the whole tragedy is that she then she kills him. That's the matriarchy defending against the patriarchy.
Oh, I see.
And then the children, Electra and Orestes. Orestes has gone off and is a student of Apollo, and he comes back and he is going to avenge his father because he's an agent of the patriarchy. And so he kills his mother.
Right.
And as a result, the agents, the divine agents of the matriarchy, the Furies, or the Eridanes, are sent after Orestes. And the Furies, are chasing him. He runs off to the Temple of Apollo, where Apollo manages to put the Furies to sleep, while he then runs off to Athens,
right.
And is saved by Athena, who is the woman born without born from a man's. Yes, there is.
Good.
Very soon.
Okay.
She is the woman born from the thigh of Zeus, so she's born without a mother. So she is the absolute archetypal patriarchal woman.
Oh my!
And she manages to calm down the Furies and turn them so they become agents of the patriarchy. And so the Oresteia, that trilogy, is really about the change, the shift between the matriarchy and the patriarchy. It's a really interesting set of plays.
That is interesting, yeah.
And sort of highlights that. But
Didi's full of this kind of information.
Full of all this sort of
it's
stuff.
really great though. I'm asking she's like a walking encyclopedia sometimes.
Yeah. Go Athena? No, I think go Furies.
Maria says go Athena, and you say go Furies.
Go Furies.
Oh yeah.
So, Athena was an agent of the patriarchy.
So where would you like to go with this?
Anyway, I just wanted to say, you asked where the origin of patriarchy is.
Yeah.
It was basically in war.
Yeah, it is fascinating. Hey, Jeffrey.
The people who had the strength and the weapons and stuff basically took over. And then they had to hold down the women. If you're going to control the women to make sure that your children are the children you consider your heirs are your children, you have to control the women. You have to make sure they behave well. You have to make sure they are segregated. You can't let them have too much power. And so you get basically Western patriarchy.
And on it went until today.
And they tied it into Christianity. Paul hated women. He had all that stuff.
Jeffrey says it's my understanding that early Egypt had powerful matriarchs.
Yeah, early Egypt had powerful matriarchs. Basically, you find other cultures. I mean, the Tibetan people and the Nepali people often have matriarchal and polyandrous families where, there are many men who, where a woman has many husbands, and the men go off and,
Oh, that's right. Polyandrous, did you say?
Polyandrous.
Yeah,
They go off and do herding and stuff like that and bring back stuff. But you find, matrilineal and matriarchal cultures all over the world. But Egypt is a good example.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, Egypt is really before that that period.
Right.
If you look from the Greek takeover of the patriarchy, it then flows on to the Roman patriarchal system and then to the Holy Roman Empire. And that's sort of the mix of Christianity and Roman Empire.
Not that we think that a matriarchy would not be violent, because
yeah,
matriarchy would be,
Boudica
can
was,
be problem.
she was pretty.
Women can be very problematic too. Anyway,
and you do have people like Boudica, who was the Celtic queen who fought the Romans.
But we're not going in a very good direction with patriarchy, are we?
Yeah,
it's bad, as you all know.
The main thing to look at is wherever it came from. Today we still have these very strong roles, which are traditional gender roles that kids, grow up with, and it's what Jeff was saying the other day.
Jeff Ginter,
that you have boys who grow up being taught they're not to feel, they shouldn't feel sad, they shouldn't cry, they should be strong, and women or girls who are told that what you need is to attract a boy. You need to be gorgeous and, and not be
not
too
all
strong.
Women. We shouldn't generalize.
No, I'm saying these are the traditional gender
thing.
roles.
Yeah, sure.
And these traditional gender roles are something feminism, particularly since the 70s, has attacked very hard.
Not neoliberal feminism, not corporate feminism.
Not corporate feminism.
Real feminism.
We're talking about Judith Butler and people like that.
Yeah.
And feminism, both radical feminism and particularly social feminism, has had a very strong push in that kind of way. Now, it's interesting that there's been increasing studies recently into what they talk about toxic masculinities. And the toxic masculinities are these masculinities that say all boys need to be tough. They need to be able to withstand pain, which is all warrior virtue, they need to not cry. They need to not be too sensitive. You need to be, able to take the tough decisions, the hard decisions.
And that makes for great fodder for war.
Yeah, you
it?
listen to these politicians.
Cannon fodder.
And particularly on the right, you hear this stuff. And you look at something, like Ajama Baraka taught.
Sorry, Jeffrey was just asking something about what are your thoughts on Eva Peron and her reign in the 20th century politics as a pioneering figure?
Well, I think Eva Peron was interesting. I think it was very specific to that culture. I think she was a great support for her husband. I think, you find strong women even within patriarchy. I don't think she really was pushing for any kind of undermining or transgressive thing of the gender roles.
Yeah. Anyway,
not in the way that somebody like Frida Kahlo did.
Sorry. Yes.
But,
Frida Kahlo. What an interesting person is Frida Kahlo.
But I mean, going to like the current stuff, you have groups like the alt-right, neo-fascists like the Daily Stormer and these kind of things. And you look at the culture of these things, and they're very masculine cultures.
Masculine in quotes.
Masculine in quotes.
Yeah.
I'm talking gender normative stuff. They're very much pushing on to the violent, hard drinking, hard living, no nonsense, punitive, they're neo-Nazis. I mean, they're aggressive, they're misogynist. They're misogynist as all get out.
It always goes hand in hand, doesn't it?
And it's interesting that you get, people like, these mass shootings, how often they're linked to white nationalism. And
misogyny.
That kind of, a lot of people have made that parallel between toxic masculinity and the mass shootings in the United States. Yeah. Well, we're in Australia. We don't have mass shootings.
Not anymore, anyway.
The mass shooting was...
Our last mass shooting was 1996, and that's when they bought back all the guns, and they've just had a recent buyback. And then our stupid Tasmanian government, just before the election, which was a few days ago, put in some sort of a clause to try and bring back semi-automatic weapons for farmers or something.
To weaken
They
the
slipped
gun
it in.
laws.
This is a Conservative government in Tasmania, and they slipped it in literally a day before the election, so people didn't notice. Can you believe that?
There's been a lot of money coming in from the gun lobby here to try and undermine Australia's laws, which is partly, I think, because they are seen as examples around the world of how gun regulation can work, and we haven't had mass shootings.
Yes, and Australia isn't enamored with guns. We don't really have that sort of love of
gun
it.
culture.
In fact, if you found out, that somebody was had a gun, you'd be really shocked and surprised.
To some degree. I mean,
I've never known. I've known a lot of people in my life, and I've never. But we live rurally.
We live rurally.
But I've never ever met anybody in Australia who I knew, who had a gun. Yeah.
I mean, basically, Australia's not a big gun culture.
Not that people may own guns, but I've just never met anybody.
Yeah, but I mean, I think Michael Moore made the point in one of his, maybe it was Bowling for Columbine, that Canada has probably higher gun ownership than the United States, and yet doesn't have these mass shootings very often anyway.
Yeah. So what does that say?
And that's partly about their culture.
Yeah, their culture.
I think...
Should we talk a little bit?
I just want to talk about the other aspects of this. Like Canada may not have a lot of mass shootings, but they have a high level of violence where the biggest number of assaults of assaults on men in Canada is of young men, between 18 and 26, by young men. And almost all of that is mediated by substance abuse. And both of those things kind of go hand in hand with those masculine norms.
Right.
The same thing is true in Australia. There's been a whole lot of people who've been killed recently in punch-ups by pubs and stuff like that. And it's almost always young men fighting with young men.
Yeah.
And it's gotten to the point where in Sydney they have had basically laws that say pubs and clubs are not able to allow new patrons in after 12,
But the interesting thing is, you don't get, this is the thing, it's like, even though they've done that, the problem is the stereotype, the masculine stereotype. Because you don't get women, it's like, for example, you don't get, I said on one of my pages at one of my groups the other day, about, that you don't see women going out and shooting masses of people, and you don't see women.
Yeah.
Very rarely do you ever get a woman losing the plot and killing their partner and their whole family in domestic violence, which happens on a regular basis throughout the world every single day. And then somebody, without fail, somebody would spit the dummy, it's usually a man, and then start saying, "Oh, you man-hating feminists," trying to shut down the conversation. But this thing about gender as a construct is creating not only great suffering for young men, for young boys who have to shove it all in, and they either a lot of them eventually, it comes out sideways in violence, and And, misogyny is everywhere, so it comes out often in violence towards women. And it, comes out in domestic violence, it comes out in rape, it comes out in mass shootings, but it's abusive to men, these stereotypes, this toxic masculine stereotype, this stereotype which is constructed, which ends up being a fodder for war. It's abusive to young boys, and it's abusive to women, obviously. And it's abusive to the planet, because if you have, if you have one gender if you have men who aren't empathetic and who don't care, they'll also probably not care about the planet, and then they end up in positions of power because they're all scrabbling for power, and it's just toxic, full stop. And that's why, in many ways, Didi and I believe, because they're constructs, they should go, and we should just have, why do we focus on these
why are we dividing?
narrow stereotypes that are really just feeding one another with BS, and they're also feeding violence. These statistics, on violence toward women, even in the world, are really quite shocking. This is just with the United States, but if you could just share that, Didi.
Yeah, in the United States, they estimate there's 20 people per minute who become victims of domestic violence. In terms of interpersonal domestic violence, 25% of women have, in a study in 2000, have been victims of interpersonal domestic violence. That's with a partner or ex-partner, and 7.6% of men. Now, that's probably a very strong underestimate. In Australia, the figures are higher. It's a more recent study. It's 33% for women, or 1 in 3, and 20%, or 1 in 5, for men. And that's a partner or an ex-partner.
And I was just saying to Didi that I've never met a woman who hasn't been harassed, sexually harassed, or harassed in general, or assaulted. In my whole life, in my 58 years of living on the planet, I've never met any woman. And the thing is, too, I wanted to just add to what I was saying, that it makes me so sad when I see young boys who are being brought into line, into this sort of, narrow little box, when they're, I'm sure you've probably all seen it in your life. You'll see a young boy and he starts to cry, and somebody will give him a bit of a swift sort of, cut it out, or, or it's not that bad, whatever. That's sort of and even today, not much has changed. They mightn't do it in public, but what goes on at home, because... Yeah. But it's so abusive, and it makes me so sad, because these are children. They're children. They you know what I mean? And it's just so sad to make, because that they're being groomed for this particular role, which is completely dysfunctional. There's nothing human about not showing emotion, or about not caring about others and empathy. Children tend to be, they show interest in others. They don't think, I'm not going to talk to you because you're black, or, racism is learned, heterosexism is learned, homophobia is learned. Babies, and they all just interact with each other. And then we corral them into these dysfunctional stereotypes, which then create me and other. And then otherization is at the core of a lot of our problems today.
And hierarchies.
And hierarchies, that's right. Otherization, we do it to non-human animals. Didi and I are both vegan. We're, vegan because we don't reject their personhood because they happen to be another species. We don't use them as resources. We respect them as sentient beings, and that we choose not to otherize them because they're not other. They're fellow, sentient beings. And the same when you're a child, we inject otherization into these young little beings who, and then they go and, of course, and otherize people. And this is where all the wars and the domestic violence and the whole terrible situation that we're in, which we're actually on the verge of extinction because of climate change, because of not taking care of our nest, It's not our nest.
Either that or nuclear
it's nuclear
death.
war. We end up in a mushroom cloud. But I mean, this isn't our nest. This is other sentient beings, including us. It's non-human and human. This is our nest, and we're right at the edge of extinction because we have, we have a patriarchy which has actually intensified in some ways these stereotypes so that it can continue on. And capitalism is very tied to it. White supremacy is very tied to it. And here we are on the edge of extinction. So this is something, what is Maria saying? We need more mentoring. Yes. Dee Dee's going to talk about that.
Okay. Yeah.
Say what Maria said.
You said we need more mentoring and we need more examples of opportunities of millennials helping the future generation. Yeah. I mean, that's great. We do. And it's like recently, I mean, there's been a number of studies, but recently we're hearing more about the toxic masculinities, and this is a problem, this as a problem. And we've also seen various studies that show that children, particularly those children, and not all children go along with these gender norms.
Yeah, sure.
Or they don't go whole hog, completely into these gender norms. But studies have shown that those kids who most take up those strong gender normative behaviors have a number of adverse outcomes. They have lower educational achievement. They usually end up with lower income achievement, higher levels of domestic violence, higher levels of substance abuse, higher levels of teen pregnancy, and it's both the boys who take on this,
It's the gift that keeps on giving.
Let's go get drunk. It's a masculine thing to do. Let's get into a fight. It's a masculine thing to do. Let's be tough. It's a masculine thing to do. And girls who go, yes, I just want to have a nice boyfriend. I want to put up with whatever they do. I want to go off and drink with them because otherwise they'd think I'm too whatever, and it's important to have a boyfriend more than anything. And it's these kind of behaviors that are increasingly being seen as incredibly bad for children. And there's been a number of programs, but we face things like in Australia, there was a program called Safe Schools a few years ago, which was an anti-bullying campaign, and it was part of the attempt by schools to introduce more diversity and to open it up and say you don't have to follow these rigid roles, and people should not be being bullied for not following these things, that people should be allowed to do these sort of things.
Allowed to be who they are,
be who they are, to be whoever they are. I mean, the Safe Schools thing talks about LGBTI people, but, it's really about anybody, the little boy who really wants to do ballet and dance.
Yeah, sure.
The girl who really enjoys, engineering or field hockey or whatever, the things that they're not supposed to, or wants to be, a builder, all of these things. The thing is that there should be nothing to stop any children who want to do these things from doing these things.
Or just be.
And just be. Well, just be. I mean, human beings are diverse. We don't need this rigidity, and it's bad for us.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's bad for our ways of thinking. Yeah. It's bad for the outcomes. Yeah. It's bad for us personally.
Yeah.
As people growing up.
I never fit into the feminine sort of idea of. It was a pain in the neck for me. Yeah. It's been a pain in the neck for me, and also the heteronormative thing. Like I'm from the LGBTI community. I don't. And I've had to, and I've had to sort of fit into the, this heteronormative thing, sometimes to get by, and I mean, they've only just recently passed, marriage equality in Australia. I mean, it's not, it's 17, it was 2017 it passed. I mean, it's really, really backward to have to grow up in a society where we physically had to enter into, a yes or no. Do you think that same-sex couples should be allowed to marry? I mean, imagine if you were presented with, if you're heterosexual and you were presented with a survey, they called it a vote, but it was a survey throughout the whole of the United States. Imagine if you were asked, should heterosexual couples be allowed to marry? How that would feel to you, So that's sort of like, that's heterosexism, where you basically you're othered, you're the otherization, and it's a real and the whole feminine nonsense of dresses and having to go to weddings and having to wear a dress because everybody will freak out if you don't or something, what I mean, all of that. It's just kind of, I have nothing against dresses. I like this, I like Indian sort of clothes, and I like Thai sort of those sarongs or whatever, but it's just this whole like it's like a thing that makes people feel more comfortable because they know. I mean, I'm generalizing here because it's not like that everywhere, and it's not as rigid as I'm saying, but, growing up in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it wasn't a lot of fun in that regard.
Except there's forces that are trying to reinforce, to reassert those rigidities.
Yeah.
I mean, I mentioned the Safe Schools program, which is a great thing. Tevero said they burned witches. They claimed people were witches and burned them.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, people are capable of really extreme things. People, gay and lesbian people were being killed. I'm sure they still are being killed. But I mean, I've known people who've been killed. I've known of people who've been killed.
Gay people?
Gay people.
Yeah. Sure.
Like gay people were being killed on a cliff walk half a mile from where I was living.
Yeah.
I've known, like, my former partner taught dance at NASDA, and one of her students was killed on Oxford Street, which
That's
is the
Sydney.
main. In Sydney, it's the main gay center, and people had come in from another suburb in order to do pufta bashing, and they killed somebody. And
and that's all because of this whole threat to the whole
recent,
male, female. And there can't be anything else
but that. There can't be anything else.
I mean, that's where a lot of all this nonsense comes from social constructs that aren't even real. And then causing all this violence because of something that isn't even real. Yeah,
It's only just recently that they've.
I mean, you've been attacked.
I've been attacked a few
Didi's
times.
had somebody whacked her across the jaw with a steel bar.
No, it was across the nose.
Oh, sorry, across the nose with a steel bar.
Yeah, I ended up losing one of the bones of my nose.
I mean,
out of
but
my
the
cheek.
thing, yes.
But I mean,
the thing is, though, we're not black. I mean, if we were black,
well, sure.
Like
there's
we're
always
white,
worse things.
Yes, exactly. We're white people, so we don't have the whole structural racist thing to deal with.
You end up with in India, women being gang raped in buses.
Full on misogyny. Anyway,
you end up, transgender people are still regularly being killed, particularly transgender people of color in the United States. I think they're up to 4 or 5 now for 2018.
I'm going to share something personal about what happened when I came out. Should I?
Yes. Just let me.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, basically these things are still going on. And the thing that happened with the Safe Schools thing is there's been a huge uproar. And one of the biggest things that they've tried to claim about Safe Schools is that it's part of some gender fluidity agenda, some trans agenda. And they're desperately frightened of the possibility of a boy in a dress. And this is something in the marriage equality thing.
Oh, yes. And,
on and on.
Hold on a
the
sec,
people,
Didi. I just wanted to say about that, the trans thing, that you'll often, not often, but you'll sometimes see trans-exclusive radical feminists, TERFs, TERFs, who have this idea that that trans women are trying to take over the feminist movement or the women's movement or something.
Now let's
just briefly, there's only probably about 1 million trans women in the world, probably, or 1 million trans people. million trans
I
women?
have no idea, but they're
Yeah,
not
I mean,
many.
not many, right?
It's
So
a
I
very
mean,
small
you know,
minority.
this nonsense that the trans women are trying to take over the women's movement. I mean, please, you know, trans people are just trying to survive and not get their face smashed in or killed. If you're a black trans person in the United States, literally there's been dozens killed, or there's been quite a few.
26 last
26
year.
last
so
year.
So far, I think there's been 4 or 5.
Yeah.
That's been 2018 already.
So anyway, it's really unfortunate, the whole trans exclusive radical feminist thing. It's just anyway, that's just a sideline. Sorry, but what were you
Anyway, you were I'll just kind of put a knot in what I was going to say.
Yes.
Basically,
Mindy's saying, thanks, Mindy. That was to you, Didi. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. Didi's really tough.
People have dealt with much worse. I mean, I've dealt with that kind of stuff since I was a very young child.
Yeah.
I was put into hospital when I was about 9 after somebody hit me in the face with a hockey stick. I mean, I've had discrimination for a long time. But, you know, like, I've also dealt with people who have had so much worse. Yeah, I consider myself fairly lucky. I'm pretty thick-skinned. It's bad. It's too bad, and it shouldn't be happening. Yeah, what really gets me is that, like in the marriage equality thing, this survey Trish was talking about, it was a ridiculous thing. It was only a delaying tactic, because here in Australia, we don't need any kind of plebiscite. The only way things would change for marriage is through parliamentary action. Now, for years, for probably 2 decades, the majority of Australians have supported marriage equality. And pretty consistently, 2/3 of people support it currently. But they said we must have a plebiscite where you give all of the homophobes and the Christian right organization the opportunity to run ads for 3 months saying how awful this would be. And people, you know, who are aware that this is what's going to happen, that it's just going to be horrible, awful nastiness in the name of, you know, equal voice on national television for months, said, no, we don't want a plebiscite. In Ireland, they needed it because their marriage thing was in the Constitution, and the only way to change that was a plebiscite. No one else had a plebiscite. They were going to do it this way. They got knocked back in Parliament, and they decided to have this survey which would have no binding effect whatsoever. So it's a totally pointless.
Yeah, it was just to drag.
It was just to drag it out
LGBT,
and to allow
to drag the LGBT community through the mud. Really, that's what it was really meant to be. But kind of getting away from.
I just wanted to say the gender thing about that. When you had the Australian Christian lobby and Tony Abbott and the conservative politicians mouthing off in the newspaper almost every day and on radio and on television, the points they made had nothing to do about marriage. So many of the points, I mean, one of the things they were saying was that same-sex couples shouldn't have families because they're always abusive, which all of the studies show is utter nonsense. And the other thing they kept saying again and again is that it's a danger and it's opening the door to gender fluidity.
Oh, yes.
Now, gender fluidity just means not having these rigid gender roles. Not having a boy who's tough and going to go and get a keg when they're a teenager and get really wasted and rape some girl, you know. And girls whose only thought is, how popular am I? You know, and do I have a boyfriend?
What size am I? Or am I a 12 or a 14?
That's about what size
binary.
I am.
That's right.
That's what and you know, we'll go into, you know, the real thing, the transgression of gender in a minute, Tevero. Tevero said binary.
Yeah.
I mean, so much of this rigid gender stuff.
And may I just add, Maria is saying trans men and trans women are welcome in Miami Beach, and we need to keep that in the conversation. Absolutely, Maria.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's
Excellent.
great.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about transgression.
Okay. Well, did you want to say about
No,
you
I
coming
don't.
out?
No, really.
Okay.
No.
Okay, transgression. I mean, when you really look at breaking down and increasingly with trans people, those gender roles have started to break down. I mean, you had trans people always. There have always been trans people. There have been, transsexual Roman emperors who wanted to have surgery and were then killed by the Praetorian Guard for being too effeminate.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's very sad.
And, you've had this throughout history. Now, obviously, there hasn't been the ability to do anything more than live as the other gender, but you have cases throughout history of women who've lived as men, of men who've lived as women, and you've had, in England, the Mollies, which were completely against the law, but they were basically effeminate men, drag queens, if you want to say. But I mean, how many of them are actually transgender? I mean, up until the 1950s, there was no option other than to be a drag queen. And people who called themselves drag queens, like Gloria Rivera, probably were more accurately transgender. They were people who lived in drag, and when you're living in drag, you're really living as a woman as much as you can. And you really only welcome in the queer community. But, with homosexuality, it's been the most extreme people, the people who are the most transgressive, who are the most noticeable. And these are the people who were...
What's your definition of like actual transgressive, that word?
Transgressive. Transgressive can be anything from, the boy who wants to be a ballerina or to study art or something like that, who doesn't want to be in these traditional, or the girl
in those constructed
who doesn't
things.
want to be part of that constructed thing.
Right, yeah. I see.
And, in the 1950s, you had Christine Jorgensen come out as the first well-known transsexual person. And for a little while, transsexual. Well, this was people who surgically changed gender.
Yes.
And this is the word. Transgender didn't come in as a word until 1965. So that's Christine Jorgensen transitioned in 1952.
Yeah.
So that was
How brave is she?
12 years before that.
How brave is she?
Yeah. And but the attention was only on that, and people who were transsexual were seen as cases within psychology, and the whole thing was pathologized and medicalized, as well as being criminalized. Like people were being arrested for cross-dressing and stuff like that. Interestingly, recently in Tasmania, the premier came out last year, the end of last year, the beginning of this year, and publicly, apologized to all the gay people who had been arrested for homosexuality, and all of their records had been expunged. But as somebody pointed out, that hasn't yet extended to all those people who were arrested for cross-dressing.
Oh, wow, hasn't it?
No. And it's interesting that, gender thing is still, that's always been there. But as more and more people started to, change sex, and you had groups like transsexual menace come out, and you had things like Camp Trans at the Michigan Women's Folk Festival, and you started to see more and more people who were actually going for the other gender in a binary sense. Things opened up, and you had transgender people who started to say, hang on, I don't feel like I'm this gender, but I don't really want to be in that extreme gender role. It was trans people who were complaining about what they called the gatekeepers. In order to get surgery, they needed the permission of 2 psychiatrists that they had to be seeing for a year. And those psychiatrists, very few psychiatrists, I mean, first let's say there were almost no surgeons. There's only a handful of people who would do that surgery, and there were almost only a handful of psychiatrists who would write the letters to permit that. And so they became the gatekeepers.
And not all trans people go for surgery, by the way.
And not all trans people go for surgery.
Yeah.
But at that time, like it was the medicalized pathway. And you couldn't get any kind of surgery unless you were following that pathway. And you had trans people who would go in, and say, the psychiatrist would say, you're not really serious. I'm not going to write you any kind of letter. You're not serious. This is to a trans woman. You're not wearing a dress.
Yeah,
you're
really?
wearing a pair of jeans.
That?
And she might say, but they're women's jeans. When I look around, almost every woman I see is wearing pants.
In Tasmania, I mean, it's mostly cold most of the time. You'd be lucky to see any women in dresses, and yet they expect...
unless you go into town.
And yet these psychiatrists expect a trans woman to wear a dress all the time.
And it's like trans women were basically saying, look, I might not want to be, the kind of girly girl that you're demanding I be for me to get any access to kind of medical stuff. Anyway, that slowly opened up. Slowly, psychiatrists in the medical profession have taken that on and realized that there are more things outside of those rigid binary roles.
But the need to pathologize and medicalize hasn't gone away. It hasn't gone away.
In order to get access to that, kids still need to prove they are trans enough to have any kind of access to that sort of stuff. But, it's not just trans people, but the thing that trans people have done is kind of help crack open. It's when the extreme people start being really visible that the less extreme people feel brave enough to sort of come out of the shadows. And you start finding there's more and more people who say, I don't feel female or male, but I don't feel female.
Whatever that means.
But I don't want to have some kind of weird $100,000 surgery that's going to result in kind of some kind of penis construct that isn't going to work very well.
Yeah.
And
unfortunately, the
and a lot of the surgery really isn't up to
for trans men.
For trans men. But I mean, they will say that I want testosterone, and I want a double mastectomy, and so they're kind of half-op or non-op, and trans people have been fighting to eliminate terms like that.
Yeah.
Basically, they say, I'm trans when I stop being that extreme gender that you're trying to put on me.
Yeah.
The gender I was assigned at birth.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not that. And increasingly, as the doors open and there starts to be little gradations in between, and it starts, instead of these really rigid poles on either side,
which creates so much suffering, not only just for the the rigid two that are there, but for everybody else.
Yeah.
You know,
it creates great suffering for the people in
Yes.
the poles, but it creates suffering for everybody in between as well.
So they need to be gotten rid of these whole gender, sort of this rigid things.
We need to get rid of some of this, these gender constructions.
Yeah.
But as it opens up, you start getting people who say, look, I don't feel like I'm one or the other. I'm non-binary.
Yeah.
And this term has come into increased use probably in the last 12 or 13 years. And you see more and more kids identifying as non-binary. But it's difficult, particularly for young kids. For young kids, I mean, they will allow them in schools sometimes to transition if they are consistent and insistent and persistent in their presentation as the other gender. Now, that means that if you're born assigned male, or if you're assigned female at birth, unless you are wanting to play guns and play games, footy with the boys, and you only want to wear pants and you want to cut your hair short and say, I'm a boy, then you're not going to get a look in because you're not consistent, persistent.
Yeah.
And
a lot of trans, young trans people are not any of those things.
Are not any of those.
No.
They're somewhere in between. There's trans girls who, like non-trans girls, aren't interested in Barbie. And they're not interested in wearing frilly dresses or being a princess. But that doesn't change the fact that they see themselves as female. Or somewhere less than that, they might see themselves as gender fluid. Some days they feel more masculine, some days they feel more feminine, some days they feel, some days or they feel like neither. There's agender, there's non-binary, there's all kinds of classifications that people that in those categories, the gender diverse categories, are starting to say, this is me. I'm not that, I'm not this, I'm not any of these other categories you've created. And really, what are any of these categories for? The only reason to have these categories is to divide society, to say, this is woman's work and this is men's work.
Or this is the way men behave.
This is the way men behave, and so much of it, as Tavero says, it's called patriarchy. Yeah. So much of it is, this is where men are and what men are supposed to be, and you've got to be strong and you've got to be uncaring because that's what it takes to be at the top.
Yeah.
And
it's killing us.
This is where women are.
It's killing us. This particularly this toxic male masculinity stereotype that's constructed. It's actually killing us. Yeah. It's killing men, because they end up blowing their head off because they can't bear it anymore. They can't bear not being able to express themselves or not. They've got it all so much shoved in that they don't even know how they feel.
Or they blow off somebody else's head.
Or they blow off, or more often than not, they blow off somebody else's head and their own head, or their whole family or whatever, or take out a bunch of people like, it is often the case with young white males who are misogynist, taking out schools, taking out children in schools.
Yeah.
I mean,
serial killers.
Sorry, my alarm went off. So anyway, so it's actually killing, it's suffocating young boys and making them miserable, and it's also turning some violent, and it's also killing people. And, eventually it's killing the planet, because if we don't have an empathetic humanity, humanity that cares about, there shouldn't be homeless people. Let's just put that right out there right now. But I mean, you can see the pinnacle of patriarchy when you've got these very powerful, rich people who have absolute contempt for anybody who doesn't have that kind of wealth, and basically wants to kill anybody, like trying to vilify homeless people and that sort of thing. There shouldn't even be any homeless people anyway.
Yeah.
But this is what patriarchy is at its end stage in a way, and it's taken us to the edge of extinction. Yeah. So this is, anyway.
One of the major aspects of patriarchy, patriarchy is definitely a hierarchical thing. It's not a case of, here's men, here's women, there's some sort of purely horizontal thing. When you add in patriarchy, you start making it a vertical system. But one of the aspects of patriarchy, particularly in the West, is individualism. You want to be the alpha male. You want to be the top person. You want to not care about the community unless you're in charge of the community. And this has been seen, particularly by a lot of feminists, as absolutely counter to kind of a more matriarchal community, where
and see, neoliberalism is anti-community. They don't want people. Yeah. Neoliberalism doesn't want people to organize.
I wanted to bring that in.
Sorry, yeah, do that.
Basically, that is the essence, where you see not only are these few people immensely wealthy, and this huge divide between them and the rest of the people, that's individualism taken to a massive extreme. They're in the God realm. They can do whatever they want. They can launch, cars into space so that they can play things on the radio in space. They can do whatever the hell they want. And they might be nice. You might have, a compassionate tyrant, but that doesn't change the fact that it's tyranny.
It's not quite Caligula, but it's kind of getting there.
Well, yeah, and you've got the lunatics, and
austerity,
you've got this huge war culture, this imperial culture. You've got to take over, and the U.S. is particularly culpable in its drive to control everything. It wants control of all of the resources.
It's an empire.
It wants global domination.
Yeah, full spectrum
that's
dominance.
Why it has, 900 plus bases around the world, and it stopped talking about the war on terror and starts talking about the enemy as those who are competitors.
Yeah.
Potential competitors.
Yeah, and this could all
end up... And they're talking about economic competitors.
Could end up in a mushroom cloud, with the Pentagon just pointing out Russia and China as the competitors.
Yeah.
It's almost like there can be only one. that Highlander film?
Yeah. There was patriarchy and capitalism.
There can be only one.
Yeah, there can be only one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have everything. I own everything. You see this, a few years ago it was like 82 people own as much as half of the rest of the population.
Now it's 3.
And then it was like 12, and then it's sort of like 8.
And now it's 3.
Like,
3 own more wealth than 90% of the population in the United States. That's an oligarchy, and this is totally unacceptable. This is why we need like a vision of the future. Like, none of these politicians who are not leaders, they're not, don't have any sort of vision. They're just corporate servants, and that's why the grassroots move, we need to create a non-violent grassroots movement and start creating community again, because neoliberalism wants community destroyed, and it's done its best by making jobs, like Alan Greenspan saying, he said instability in employment is good for the economy. Instability in employment is good for the economy. And that's how perverse it is. So they want everybody to feel insecure, and that's why MMT is such a great thing, because it's displaying the economics as it really is, and that's why we all need to understand MMT. But neoliberalism is something that needs to be destroyed. It needs to be, and non-violently, of course, and the MMT is part of it, but we need to start creating community, because it's patriarchy and neoliberalism and all of that. It's all hand in hand. It's anti-community. It's anti-people. Anyway, so we've gone kind of in a way off of the gender
topic.
constructions and
But
stuff.
it's
It's all related, though.
It's all related.
And patriarchy and the
it's
whole
something
thing.
to remember.
And no,
that
we're not man-hating feminists because we're bringing this up. This is something that we're all going to benefit from.
No,
know, everybody,
the
every
female
human
roles aren't helpful. The male roles aren't helpful.
Every human on the planet is going to benefit from this deconstruction of these constructed, damaging stereotypes. Everyone is going to benefit from that.
And within kind of a Western patriarchal system, it doesn't necessarily help to put a woman in charge, because quite often you end up with Maggie Thatcher.
Yeah, or Hillary Clinton.
Or Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
And it's like they're the people who become...
They embody
female
patriarchy.
Men, who...
Well...
Yeah.
They embody patriarchy because they've adopted all the sort of things that have allowed them to get to the top. I mean, you're not going to get sort of somebody... You just... At this stage, you're not going to get people who are wanting... the best, even if they claim they are, wanting the best for the planet and wanting the best for a community. You're just not going to get that unless...
But one of the things we need to remember is that change begins to happen at a community level and an individual level. Yeah. And it's going to be really important for our kids and for us, and to include in the agenda for change, to include in our notions of what we need to change, that we need to start breaking down all of these gendered things. I mean, it's like, I was talking to somebody who's the Lord Mayor of Hobart the other day, about some such great person.
Yeah.
And saying that, well, one of the things, like you could just not have gendered categories. It's not about putting, male, female, or other, and having a third or having 83 categories or any of this stuff. It's about, let's throw the whole thing out. Why do you need that?
In Canberra, in fact, in the capital of Australia.
I was talking about in Canberra.
In the capital of Australia.
The Australian Capital Territory, kind of like D.C. in the United States. They've eliminated that from driver's licenses because how is driving different for men and for women? It shouldn't be. The rules are the same. It shouldn't matter whether the driver is male or female. And, if you're talking about how will the police identify somebody, well, if the police come up and try to identify somebody and they're a trans man, and they were born male at birth or assigned male at birth, and now have had a double mastectomy, have been on testosterone, are balding and have a full beard. If that policeman looks at them and says, and sees their sex is F on the driver's license, how is that going to help anybody?
Yeah.
It's certainly not going to help the policeman.
Yeah.
It's certainly not going to help the person who's suddenly been outed. And what difference does it make? If that person was speeding, they were speeding. If that person is has a parking light out, they had a parking light out. It doesn't matter. And so many of these things. Why does it matter in employment? How are people treated differently? We know they are. We know people can do the same work, and get different wages. And that should not be the case.
No.
If we believe in any kind of an equal society.
I mean, I still find it amazing that there's still this great disparity with women's wages and men's wages. Good Lord.
Good Lord.
I mean, why is that even allowed to happen? Anyway, so what else can we, because we probably should be rounding it up soon because...
But it's so important.
I don't know how long we've been talking, a long time.
It's so important to start breaking down these, gendered norms, because they're really toxic.
Yeah.
And we've been talking a lot and hearing a lot from a lot of commentators about toxic masculinity, and that's true, and that needs to go. But there's toxic femininity as well.
Yeah, sure.
And that is those roles that, as you say, body image and that sort of stuff. But that body image goes into being attractive.
Yeah.
You know,
Whatever that is,
of
attractive in
attracting
quotes.
men and of playing stupid. You still see that kind of stuff.
And this
given as
obsession
advice.
and this body shaming that's constantly thrown at women on social media. I mean, don't you get, it's just appalling.
Don't you get
like,
sick of it?
I mean, you can almost guarantee, like, if when I'm doing vlogs on YouTube, and I'm just recording them, not live, sometimes, you'll have the occasional completely misogynist comment, saying about, sort of looks and stuff. I mean, it's like misogyny is so ingrained in society that without fail, when there's a public female personality, they'll go for the way they look. They're too fat, they're not, they're too skinny, their hair is this, and you know what I mean? Or their face is too, it's absolutely appalling that here we are in 2018 and it's getting worse. I don't know, maybe social media, it's just maybe there's a lot of trolling going on more than there actually, there is a lot of trolling, paid trolling too, but I mean it's like I don't know what it would have been like if we'd had social media.
Misogyny
I don't know if what it would have been like if we had social media in the 70s and 80s, whether it would have been as bad as this, but it just seems like it's absolutely appalling. The sort of misogyny that I've seen on social media is just, it's absolutely, it's like stomach turning.
Well, I mean, there again, it's just like the neo-fascists. So much of the trolling is done by young white men, and so much of it is very patriarchal, very misogynist, and it fits right into those gender norms about being uncaring, about laughing about it, about being violent, about being aggressive, about oh, you're a snowflake, you have feelings,
I don't know.
What kind of shit is that?
Just Evan, just also, it's almost like there's this conditioning to, like, if you've noticed even that a lot of the TV series are becoming more and more sadistic, like Game of Thrones. I mean, sadism is just like a huge thing in Game of Thrones. And I noticed that this was being introduced, first it was being introduced into TV series as
animals.
Towards animals, like I almost could guarantee if I saw an animal coming into to the screen, I thought, I bet you they're going to do something bad to that animal. And sure enough, it was either for comedy factor or if it was just sadism. And then it moved into, I noticed that then TV series started moving into sadism towards humans. And so it's almost like, I don't know, I mean, this can sound a little bit paranoid on my part, but it's almost like, these large corporations who benefit from the US empire going in and taking over these countries, bombing the bejesus out of them, and then their corporations move in, and the government and corporations like that work together, that they're almost trying to condition us all to just have no empathy whatsoever, to actually get excited by sadism. Do you know what I mean? And to get excited by violence. Yeah. There's more and more and more of it, and you see the NRA literally putting links in video games for children with that can take you directly to the gun shop which sells the gun that's in that video. You know what I mean? That's literally a thing that the NRA does.
Video games.
Video games. Yeah. So I mean, this is like it's almost like this sort of desperate conditioning to make us really just not give a shit. Not give a shit about fellow human beings. And, we're using animals as a society anyway, because most of us aren't vegan. So that needs to change. And that's why I talk about veganism on Real Progressivism and elsewhere. But, this is what I'm saying, though.
A lot of desensitization.
Desensitization. Anyway, that was just a side note. It's just something I've noticed over the last decade or so. Anyway, so what else should we say?
Okay,
then we should probably wrap it up.
I wanted to go back to that thing. While the transgender people are really an obvious attack on the erosion of those really rigid gender roles, it's not just about the transgender people. There is huge diversity within men or within women. I mean, there are non-binary categories in between, and that's fine, and those people cop a lot of violence, aggression, and whatever, and that should stop. But I mean, there's all kinds of variation and what would have been considered transgression, even among the binary gender roles. And I think feminism has really opened up gender expression for women. The men need something about opening up the gender expression for men. But really what we need to do is just start getting rid of these things. These classifications are really unnecessary.
Yeah.
They're really unnecessary. We need to stop thinking. I mean, I will tell a little story. I had somebody who came to me wondering if they were transgender. As Trish said, I'm a sexual health person. And I said, well, why do you think you might be transgender? And he said, he had all of these feminine traits. He was nurturing and compassionate, and he did a lot of communication and all of these kind of things. And I said, well, sure, but do you feel that you are female? And he said, well, no. And I said, do you feel any urge at all to change your body? And he said, no. And I said, well, I think the problem is not that you are transgender, but that you are calling these things feminine traits. Mm-hmm. They're human traits.
Yeah, yay!
And we need to stop with this masculine trait and feminine trait, and men are from Mars and women are from Venus. And men are from, I don't know, New York, and women are from New Jersey. Whatever. Like it's all both closer and, like there is some physiological differences and some kinds of differences. And it's hard to know how much of that is because of cultural conditioning. But the amount of overlap, I mean, if this curve here is the curve of difference within men, and this curve here is the curve of difference within women, those curves are very, very fucking close. Excuse me. Those curves overlap to such a degree. I mean, you don't have to say that the fastest woman is faster than 99% of men. You can say that the woman who is at, maybe 60% in terms of the fastest is probably faster than at least 55% of men. These kind of things, women can be strong, women can be fast, women can do engineering, in Iran.
But even if they can't, who cares?
I recently saw something in Iran about a young woman who became an engineer and just built this fabulous bridge. But we need to break down these gender roles.
Can I just ask you
and stop thinking that way?
Yeah, if you were if you were to sum up sort of why there's this sort of such extreme measures to keep this sort of binary construction, these constructed stereotypes, what is the motivation, for sort of corporations or just in general? Why are we now and there's parents and there's all sorts of people are so petrified about any sort of deviation from these things? What is it that's so frightening, and why do you think it's sort of?
I think from the standpoint of parents, you have some parents who are very rigid themselves and feel that their children are a reflection on them. And so they want their children, men particularly, they want their son to be a real man. They want their daughter to be a little darling.
But why is that, do you think?
Why is that? Well, I mean, in that case, they think that their children are an extension of themselves. And so, for their own self-esteem, they think, their children need to be this and this.
Yeah.
Or maybe they're just punitive. You get
Because
people
gay LGBT community don't have problems so much with their own. Most LGBTIQ people don't have problems with the way they are. It's really society that has a problem with the way they are, and that's then where one gets depression and all that sort of thing.
Well, I think for a lot of parents who are not hooked into that thing, I mean, I think we need to remember that people are different.
Yes.
Everybody's different.
That's right.
But there's probably a fairly large group of parents who are just concerned for their child. They want their child to be accepted.
This is interesting too, talking about, this fear, that there's a lot of parents who get a lot of crap from other people and from medical practitioners about their children being vegan, for goodness sake. And one of the reasons is it's this almost unthinkable thing that one could live their life without, participating in the exploitation of animals, without eating animal products too. It's almost like this unthinkable thing, and it's like, if you deviate out of that, there's something...
what are you going to deprive your child of?
Yes, there's something wrong, and that you'll be, you know what I mean? It's like this, it's this fear of anybody deviating outside a mainstream sort of a thing, which actually is an exploitation, it's a violence towards non-human animals. And instead of sort of thinking, oh, isn't that great? And by the way, you can be completely healthy, eating a plant-based diet and being vegan and, not using and not needing to use animals for food, clothing, etc. Instead of celebrating that, there's this big freak out, it's not so much, it's changing, and it's actually, veganism is no longer fringe, it is changing, but still, you still get this, these, I'll see it even on my live streams, some people will get so upset at the idea, and this is, it's interesting, isn't it? It just reminded me, when, some parents get so upset, if a child isn't fitting into this particular stereotypical norm, and you see it in the safe schools thing. I mean, there are people who have just done their best to try and get rid of the safe schools program, because they think it's just sort of sad.
And try and get rid of any kids who might be different. But anyway, that usually is hand in hand. But you were asking, where it comes from, why it's so pervasive. Well, I think in the one hand, there are kids who are afraid of that. And I think there's also the thing that patriarchy wants to reinforce itself. Patriarchy doesn't want to lose power. I think people are comfortable in what they know, but more than that, I think, there are conscious efforts to not have those differentials in power undermined. I mean, men don't want women to be free. And you see that, and I'm not saying all men, but I mean, that extreme, you see the men go and shoot their woman, in quotes, and their children, in quotes,
property.
Their property. If they are not going to escape from them, and then they'll kill themselves. But you don't see women, out there going off after their ex to kill them, and then killing
kill
their kids and the family.
Anyway,
a woman might kill their ex if he's coming after them. Or if they were incredibly abusive. But that's usually the context that kind of thing happens.
Anyway, it'll be a better world if we all just have human traits, that we don't have this sort of rigid thing. And it's going to kill us, really. The masculine stereotype in particular is going to kill us. And of course, a lot of women support that stereotype too, and it's actually killing us. It's killing all of us, and it's killing the planet. Because if we don't have empathy, and we don't have sensitivity, and we don't have a good sense of justice for those that are disenfranchised and all that kind of thing, we need to have a vision of what kind of world we want. And we shouldn't be having homeless people. We shouldn't be having poverty. We should be having social equality. We shouldn't be having heterosexism, racism, and all that kind of stuff. And that comes from an otherization, and that otherization starts with this binary stereotype that's
A lot
constructed. A lot of it comes
starts
from that.
with our gender stuff.
So I mean,
yeah.
it's not a little thing, this social construct, binary stereotype.
And really, if we start dismantling it in schools,
Yeah.
there is no reason.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like in Australia, there's been a few schools in Australia, typically, schools have uniforms. And they do that in order to break down the barriers between those people who have fancy clothes and those people who don't. But there's been increasingly schools in Australia where they have non-gendered uniforms, where they no longer have girls in skirts and boys in pants.
Mm.
Yeah, they put everybody in pants. Why not? Girls wear pants all the time anyway.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
Anyway, we should really wrap it up now.
Anyway, there's no reason whatsoever.
Yeah, okay. I think we've got that. But there's no reason whatsoever, sorry, to what?
To have any differentiation, like built in for gender in schools. Yeah. Let kids differentiate however they want.
And it's not
with whatever combination of traits they want.
It's not a gay agenda. It's not a trans agenda.
It's not about trans.
It's a human thing to be able to be human. For little young boys to be able to express emotion and feelings and not be afraid of being sort of vilified for it or being bullied for it and all of that. I mean, how sad is that? How sad is that young children being sort of like smushed into this effing can and these eventually, I mean, they're not destroyed, these attributes, but they're so suffocated till eventually, so a lot of young men don't even know how they feel. I mean, how abusive is that for men? You know what I mean?
A lot of them can't even really describe their emotions or give any kind of emotional readout beyond mad, sad, and glad.
Yes, sad, and glad.
It's
Jeez
like
Louise.
That's the only differentiation you can.
I think I would want to blow my head off if that's all I could register about myself. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So this just has to, and it would be nice to get John Lennon back. Anyway, so Jeffrey says. Yeah. So anyhow, I think he'd be horrified actually the way things have gone, particularly the wars. This expansion of wars.
But
anyway, let's kind of. We really should.
I just want to make one point. We're not saying people should be neutral. We're saying people should be able to be whatever they want.
Yes. If somebody wants to be girly girl, whatever that means,
that's fine.
Go for it. And if somebody wants to do the whole, I mean, it'd be better if they're not doing some sort of, John Wayne kind of weird thing.
It's better if they don't tie violence into it.
Yeah, don't tie violence into it. Fine, they can.
But if everybody can be whatever they want, and people can accept that diversity, we're actually arguing for diversity.
Yeah, gender diversity.
Not for neutrality.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. So that's really what we're trying to say, and we took an hour and a half to say it. Anyway, so we meandered. We meandered, which is what we tend to do. What I tend to do, and when Dee Dee sits down to do stuff with me on Faint Signals from Vega occasionally, which is always fun. We tend to meander too. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, and thanks for your comments and everything. We didn't get to sort of say all of them, but see all of them. But I'll check them out, and we really, really appreciate it. And hopefully I'll have Dee Dee on again to either talk about a specific part of agenda stuff at another time, if she would like to, or she has so much knowledge about so many different areas that I probably invite her on to talk about some other issues too. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. My name is Trish Roberts, and this is Dee Dee River, and you're watching on Real Progressives, but this is Faint Signals from Vega, from faintsignalsfromvega.com. Until next time, thanks for watching. Bye for now.
Bye.